The morning sun peeked through the tall windows of the county courthouse as Detective Simone Washington stepped through the heavy wooden doors. The familiar smell of old books and furniture polish filled the air. She checked her watch, 8:15 a.m. She was early, just as she liked to be. Simone straightened her navy blue pantsuit and adjusted the badge clipped to her belt. After 15 years on the police force, she had finally earned her detective shield last spring. Today was her third time testifying in court since the promotion, but something felt different about this case. She nodded at the security guards who knew her by name. "Big day, Detective?" asked the older guard with salt and pepper hair. "Just another day seeking justice, Frank," she replied with a small smile. But they both knew this wasn't just any case. The Arlington Heights drug trafficking trial had been all over the local news for weeks. Simone made her way to the water fountain near Courtroom 7. Her throat felt dry. The night before, she had gone over her case notes repeatedly, making sure every detail was fresh in her mind. The prosecution was counting on her testimony about the evidence she'd uncovered during the 6-month investigation. She took a sip of water and glanced at the people starting to file into the courtroom, reporters with notepads, anxious family members, law students watching real court proceedings. None of them paid much attention to her. Without her uniform, she blended in with the crowd, just another face in the busy courthouse. Simone checked her phone one last time before turning it to silent. There was a text from her mother, "Praying for you today. Speak your truth." She smiled and slipped the phone into her pocket. As she waited on the hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, Simone watched 2 defense attorneys hurry past, their expensive suits and confident stride marking them as clearly as any uniform. One of them gave her a dismissive glance. She was used to it. Being underestimated had happened her whole career. The courthouse clock ticked loudly in the hallway. Simone closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. She thought back to her academy days when her instructor had told her, in the courtroom, "You're not just speaking for yourself. You're the voice of every person who's been harmed." At 8:45, the courtroom doors opened. Simone stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked in with measured steps. The room was larger than she remembered. Rows of polished benches, the state flag hanging beside the judge's bench, the court reporter setting up her equipment. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s named Helen Chen, caught Simone's eye and gave her a subtle nod. They had prepared for this testimony together, going over likely questions and answers. Helen had warned her about Judge Harmon. "He can be difficult," Helen had said during their prep session. "Especially with police witnesses. Don't take it personally." Simone took her seat in the front row, watching as the room filled. The defendants entered with their lawyers, avoiding eye contact with everyone. She recognized their faces from months of surveillance photos. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Harmon." The side door opened and Judge Harmon swept in, his black robe flowing behind him. He was a tall man with thinning gray hair and deep-set eyes that seemed to judge everyone even before the trial began. Simone noticed how he barely looked at anyone as he took his seat at the bench. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying authority that came from years of being obeyed without question. As the proceedings began, Simone felt her heartbeat quicken. In 20 minutes, she would be called to testify. She had done this before, but never with a judge who had such a reputation for being harsh. Little did she know that this routine court appearance would soon become anything but routine. The testimony she was about to give would set in motion events that would shake the very foundation of the local justice system. And Judge Harmon's treatment of her would reveal something much darker than a simple bad attitude. Simone took a deep breath as the first witness was called. She had no way of knowing that by the end of this day, her name would be known across the country for reasons no one in the courtroom could possibly imagine. The tension in Courtroom 7 grew as the morning wore on. Detective Simone Washington watched the proceedings carefully, making mental notes as other witnesses took the stand. The room had warmed up considerably with all the bodies packed inside, and she could feel a drop of sweat making its way down her back beneath her jacket. Every time the door to the judge's chambers opened, she felt the cool rush of air conditioning. Judge Richard Harmon seemed to make sure his comfort was everyone else's priority. Whenever he entered or exited, he moved like he owned not just the courtroom, but the entire building. At 63, Judge Harmon had a full head of silver hair that he kept meticulously combed back. His reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck, and he had a habit of putting them on and taking them off dramatically for effect. His black robe was always freshly pressed, with sleeve cuffs so crisp they could practically cut paper. "His Honor thinks he's still on TV," whispered the court officer standing near Simone. She gave him a questioning look. "Before he was a judge, he had a small-time legal show on local cable," the officer explained with a smirk. "Never let anyone forget it either." Simone nodded politely but kept her expression neutral. In her years on the force, she'd learned that courthouse walls had ears. Besides, she needed to stay focused. When the bailiff finally called her name, Simone stood and walked confidently to the witness stand. As she moved past the defense table, she felt their attorney's eyes following her, sizing her up. She had testified against his clients before and knew he would try to discredit her work. "State your name and occupation for the record," the clerk said after Simone was sworn in. "Detective Simone Washington, County Police Department, Narcotics Division," she replied clearly. Judge Harmon barely looked up from the papers he was shuffling. The sound of his pen scratching against paper filled the silence. It was as if he found anything more interesting than her presence. "You may proceed," he said to the prosecutor, still not making eye contact with Simone. Helen Chen approached the stand with purpose. "Detective Washington, please tell the court about your involvement in the investigation of the defendants." Simone began explaining the 6-month operation that had led to the arrests, carefully laying out how the evidence had been gathered. She had prepared for this, keeping her language clear and free of police jargon that might confuse the jury. Twice during her testimony, Judge Harmon sighed loudly, making a show of checking his watch. The third time, he interrupted her mid-sentence. "Detective, we don't have all day. Get to the point," he said sharply. "Yes, Your Honor," Simone replied, not letting his tone rattle her. She continued with her testimony, but noticed how Judge Harmon's interruption had made the jury shift uncomfortably in their seats. When it came time for cross-examination, the defense attorney wasted no time attacking her credibility. "Detective Washington, isn't it true that you've only been a detective for less than a year?" he asked, emphasizing the word "only" as if it invalidated everything she had said. "Yes, but I've been with the department for 15 years, she answered. The attorney smiled thinly. "And in those 15 years, how many times have your cases been thrown out due to procedural errors?" Before she could answer, Judge Harmon leaned forward with sudden interest. It was the first time he seemed engaged in her testimony, but only because it might show her in a negative light. "I've had 2 cases where evidence was ruled inadmissible," she said honestly, "but neither was due to my errors." The defense attorney pressed on. "2 failures, then? And yet you expect this court to believe your testimony about my clients is flawless." "Objection," Helen called out. "Mischaracterization." "Overruled," Judge Harmon said quickly, waving his hand dismissively. "The witness will answer." Simone took a deep breath. "I stand by my investigation and the evidence collected." Judge Harmon looked directly at her for the first time, his eyes cold. The room seemed to chill as he stared her down, clearly unhappy with her confident response. Something in his expression told Simone this was about to get much worse. What she didn't know was that Judge Harmon had his own reasons for wanting her testimony discredited, reasons that went far beyond this case, and those reasons would soon come to light in the most unexpected way. The air in the courtroom grew heavier as the cross-examination continued. Detective Simone Washington maintained her composure despite the defense attorney's increasingly aggressive questions. She had faced tough questioning before, but something about today felt different, like the defense and Judge Harmon were working together to undermine her. "Detective Washington," the defense attorney said, pacing in front of the witness stand, "you claim that you personally witnessed my client accepting a package on May 15th. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Simone answered clearly. "And you were how far away?" "Approximately 50 yards, using standard-issue binoculars." The defense attorney raised his eyebrows dramatically for the jury's benefit. 50 yards. Through binoculars. At dusk. And you're absolutely certain it was my client? Simone leaned slightly forward. "Yes, I am certain. I had clear visibility, and your client was wearing a distinctive red jacket that matched what we'd seen in previous surveillance." Before the attorney could ask another question, Judge Harmon cut in. Detective, may I remind you to answer only what is asked, not to volunteer additional information. Simone blinked, surprised by the interruption. I apologize, Your Honor. I was clarifying my answer. Judge Harmon's mouth tightened into a thin line. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension. The defense attorney seemed encouraged by the judge's intervention. Let's move on to the audio recordings. You testified that you heard my client discussing prices and delivery dates. Yet the recording itself is, as you admitted, somewhat unclear due to background noise. There is some background noise, but the key statements are audible, Simone replied. So we're supposed to trust your interpretation of what was said. The attorney's voice dripped with skepticism. The recording was enhanced by our technical team, Simone began, and a transcript was. Your Honor, the defense attorney interrupted, throwing his hands up. The witness continues to elaborate beyond the scope of my questions. Judge Harmon's face darkened as he leaned forward. Detective Washington, this is the second time I've had to remind you about proper courtroom procedure. Answer only what is asked of you. Simone took a deep breath. I understand, Your Honor. The prosecutor, Helen Chen, stood up. Your Honor, the witness should be allowed to fully explain her answers when they involve technical evidence. Ms. Chen, I know how to run my courtroom. Judge Harmon snapped. Sit down. Helen reluctantly took her seat, exchanging a concerned glance with Simone. The defense attorney continued with renewed confidence. Detective Washington, isn't it true that you've been passed over for promotion twice before finally making detective last year? Simone's jaw tightened slightly. Yes, that's true. And isn't it also true that you were eager, perhaps too eager, to make a big case to prove yourself worthy of the promotion? Objection, Helen called out. Calls for speculation about the witness's motives. I'll allow it, Judge Harmon said immediately. Answer the question, Detective. Simone kept her voice steady. No, that's not true. I approached this case with the same professionalism I bring to all my work. The defense attorney smirked. Yet this is the first major drug trafficking case you've led as detective, isn't it? It's the first one that reached trial under my lead, yes, Simone acknowledged. So a lot riding on this for you, professionally speaking. Before Simone could answer, Helen was on her feet again. Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning has nothing to do with the evidence. Judge Harmon's face reddened. Overruled, he barked. Then he turned to Simone. The witness will answer. My professional reputation depends on honesty and accurate police work, not on any particular case outcome, Simone responded firmly. That's when something in Judge Harmon snapped. He slammed his hand down on the bench, making everyone in the courtroom jump. Detective Washington, your attitude is bordering on contempt of court, he said, his voice rising. Who exactly do you think you are? The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered motionless above her keyboard. Simone straightened her shoulders. Detective Simone Washington, County Police Department, she replied with quiet dignity. Judge Harmon scoffed loudly, the sound echoing through the silent room. He leaned into his microphone and said clearly, well, Detective Nobody in my courtroom, you speak when permitted. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A juror's mouth fell open. The prosecutor looked stunned. Simone sat perfectly still, her face giving away nothing as the judge's words hung in the air. But behind her calm exterior, her mind was racing. In 15 years of law enforcement, she had faced disrespect and prejudice, but never so blatantly, never from someone in such a position of power, and never in front of a packed courtroom. What Judge Harmon didn't know was that his words had just changed everything, and the next few minutes would change his life forever. The courtroom remained eerily silent after Judge Harmon's shocking words. Detective Simone Washington sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Her face revealed nothing, but her mind was racing a mile a minute. This moment, this public humiliation, had just accelerated something much bigger than anyone in the room could imagine. Prosecutor Helen Chen finally broke the silence. Your Honor, I request a 15-minute recess. Judge Harmon waved his hand dismissively. Fine. Court will resume at 11:30. He banged his gavel once and stood up, his robe swishing as he disappeared through the door to his chambers. As people began to murmur and move about, Simone quietly stepped down from the witness stand. A court officer gave her a sympathetic look. "Never seen him go that far before," he whispered. "And I've been here 12 years. Simone nodded but said nothing. She walked over to Helen, who was hastily gathering papers at the prosecution table. "I need to make a call," Simone said quietly. Helen looked up, her eyes concerned. "Are you okay? We can file a complaint about his behavior." A small, knowing smile crossed Simone's face. "I'm fine, but I need to use your phone. Mine's in my locker." Helen handed over her cell phone without question. Simone stepped into the hallway, found a quiet corner, and dialed a number she knew by heart. "It's Washington," she said when someone answered. "We need to move now." She listened for a moment. "Yes, today. He just gave us the perfect opening." Another pause. 15 minutes. Have everyone in position. What Judge Harmon didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Detective Simone Washington wasn't just any detective. For the past 6 months, she had been working undercover with a special task force investigating judicial corruption. And Richard Harmon was their primary target. It had started with anonymous tips from court employees and lawyers, cases mysteriously dismissed, lenient sentences for certain defendants, and rumors of cash-filled envelopes passed in parking garages. The police chief had handpicked Simone for the investigation because of her attention to detail and spotless record. Simone handed the phone back to Helen when she returned. "There's something you should know," she said in a low voice. She led Helen to a corner of the empty jury room and explained the situation quickly. Helen's eyes widened. "So all this time you've been building a case against him," Simone confirmed. "We have bank records showing deposits of exactly $10,000, just under the reporting threshold, made 2 days after he dismissed 3 separate felony cases. We have photos of him meeting with known associates of the defendants in today's case, and we have a recording of him discussing how he would handle today's testimony." "My God," Helen whispered. "I'd always thought he was just arrogant, not corrupt." "He's both," Simone replied. "And we were planning to move next week, but after what just happened." Helen shook her head in disbelief. "What do you need from me?" "Just act surprised," Simone said with a hint of a smile. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Harmon was pouring himself a glass of water with shaking hands. He hadn't meant to lose his temper so publicly. Something about that detective got under his skin, the way she wouldn't be intimidated, how she kept answering questions with such confidence. He loosened his collar and took a deep breath. He would regain control when court resumed. After all, he was Judge Richard Harmon. He'd been on the bench for nearly 20 years. Nobody questioned his authority in his courtroom. He didn't notice the unmarked police car pulling up behind the courthouse. He didn't see the 4 officers from Internal Affairs entering the building through the staff entrance, signing in with security and showing their badges. He had no idea that copies of bank statements, surveillance photos, and transcripts of damning conversations were being organized in a folder right at that moment. Judge Harmon checked his watch. 5 more minutes until court resumed. He straightened his robe in the mirror, practicing his stern expression. He would put that detective in her place once and for all. But Detective Simone Washington had other plans. And in just a few minutes, the man who had called her a nobody would discover exactly who she was. The 15-minute recess felt like both an eternity and not nearly enough time. Detective Simone Washington stood in the hallway outside Courtroom 7, briefing the 4 Internal Affairs officers who had arrived. They were all in plainclothes, 2 women and 2 men wearing business attire that helped them blend in with the lawyers and court staff. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Simone said to the senior officer, handing over a thick folder, "everything you need is in here. Bank records, photos, witness statements, and transcripts of 3 recorded conversations." The lieutenant, a woman with sharp eyes and 20 years on the force, flipped through the documents. "This is solid work, Washington. You sure you want to move today? We can wait until after the trial." Simone shook her head. "He crossed a line in there. If we wait, he might try to cover his tracks." "Fair enough," Rodriguez agreed, closing the folder. "Your call. You've been running point on this for months." Down the hall, court reporter Tanya Wilson was grabbing coffee from the vending machine when she overheard 2 lawyers talking. "Did you hear what Harmon said to that detective?" one whispered. "Called her a nobody right to her face." "That's Harmon for you," the other replied. "Guy thinks he's untouchable." Tanya frowned. In her 8 years working in this courthouse, she typed up thousands of transcripts, including plenty where Judge Harmon had been harsh or even rude. But today had been different. There had been something personal about the way he spoke to Detective Washington, something that made Tanya uncomfortable enough that she'd marked that exchange with a special note in her transcript. Back in the courtroom, people were filing in for the resumption of proceedings. The defendants whispered nervously to their attorney, who seemed distracted, constantly glancing toward the door as if expecting something. Prosecutor Helen Chen organized her notes at her table, trying to appear normal despite knowing what was about to happen. She'd worked with Judge Harmon for 5 years and had always found him difficult, but learning he was corrupt has shaken her. How many cases had been compromised? How many guilty people had walked free because of his greed? The bailiff entered from a side door and cleared his throat. "All rise," he called out. "Court is now in session." The Honorable Judge Richard Harmon presiding. Judge Harmon swept into the courtroom, his robe billowing behind him. He seemed to have regained his composure during the recess, settling into his chair with an air of authority. His face showed no sign of regret for his earlier outburst. "Be seated," he commanded, adjusting his reading glasses. "Ms. Chen, you may continue with your redirect examination of the witness." Helen stood. "Your Honor," Detective Washington stepped out momentarily. She should be back any second. Judge Harmon's mouth tightened. "This court's time is valuable, counselor. If your witness cannot be bothered to return promptly." The main doors of the courtroom swung open. Detective Washington entered, but she wasn't alone. The 4 internal affairs officers followed behind her, spreading out as they entered the room. The courtroom fell silent as people sensed something unusual was happening. Judge Harmon's eyes narrowed. "Detective Washington, what is the meaning of this interruption?" Simone walked forward confidently, stopping at the center of the courtroom. She reached into her jacket and pulled out her badge, holding it up so everyone could see it clearly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the room, "I apologize for the delay. There was an urgent matter I needed to address." The judge's face darkened. "Whatever police business you have can wait until after your testimony. Return to the stand immediately." "I'm afraid this can't wait," Simone replied. She nodded to Lieutenant Rodriguez, who stepped forward and placed the folder on the prosecutor's table. "This police business directly concerns this court." A murmur rippled through the spectators. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, waiting. The defense attorney half rose from his chair, then slowly sat back down. Judge Harmon's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Detective, I'm warning you." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Simone cut in, something she would never normally do, "I'm not here as a witness anymore." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Judge Harmon's face. His eyes darted to the internal affairs officers, then back to Simone. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Simone took another step forward. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The moment hung in the air, a turning point that would change everything. The tension in courtroom 7 was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye was fixed on Detective Simone Washington as she stood firmly in the center of the room, facing Judge Harmon. The 4 internal affairs officers had positioned themselves strategically, 2 near the judge's bench, 2 by the doors. "Your Honor," Simone said, her voice steady and clear. "For the past 6 months, I've been leading an investigation into judicial misconduct in this county." Judge Harmon's face flushed deeper. "This is completely inappropriate. I'm holding you in contempt." He reached for his gavel, but Lieutenant Rodriguez moved closer to the bench. "I suggest you hear her out, Your Honor." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old ceiling fan creaking overhead. The defendants looked confused, their attorney frozen in place. In the gallery, someone had started filming with a cell phone despite the court rules against it. No one moved to stop them. "Richard Harmon," Simone continued, using the judge's name without his title for the first time, "as the lead investigator of the County Judicial Corruption Task Force, I am placing you under arrest." A collective gasp spread through the room. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word. "The charges are accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, abuse of office, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice." Simone's voice never wavered as she recited the charges. Judge Harmon's shock quickly turned to rage. He stood up, slamming both hands on his bench. "This is absurd. I am a judge of this court. You can't arrest me in my own courtroom." "Actually, we can," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, stepping forward and placing the folder on the judge's bench. "Everything we need is right here. Bank records showing regular deposits of $9,900, just under the reporting threshold, made 2 days after you dismissed charges against specific defendants. Coincidence?" Harmon spluttered, but his face had gone from red to pale. Another officer approached the bench. "We also have photographs of you meeting with Thomas Webb at the Riverside Motel. Mr. Webb happens to be the brother of one of today's defendants." The defense attorney suddenly stood up. "I had no knowledge of any of this," he announced to the room, backing away from his clients. Judge Harmon looked around wildly, like a cornered animal. "This is a setup. That detective has had it in for me. She fabricated everything because I disciplined her in court." Simone shook her head slowly. "The investigation began 6 months ago, Your Honor, long before today's trial. Your behavior today just confirmed what we already knew, that you abuse your power." From her pocket, Simone pulled out a small recorder. "With permission from the district attorney and the chief judge, we've been recording in your chambers. Would you like me to play the conversation you had with Mr. Webb last Thursday about how you would handle today's testimony?" For the first time, real fear flashed across Judge Harmon's face. "Step down from the bench, Mr. Harmon," Lieutenant Rodriguez said firmly. The bailiff, who had been watching in stunned silence, finally moved. But instead of intervening, he stepped aside, making way for the officers. Judge Harmon's shoulders slumped slightly. The fight seemed to drain out of him as the reality of his situation sank in. He removed his reading glasses slowly, folded them, and placed them carefully on the bench. "You're making a terrible mistake," he said, but his voice had lost its authority. Simone approached the bench, handcuffs ready. "Please step down and place your hands behind your back." The symbolism was lost on no one. The black woman he had called a nobody minutes ago was now placing him under arrest. The power had shifted completely. As he descended the 3 steps from the bench, Judge Harmon glared at Simone. "You planned this humiliation, didn't you? Arresting me in my own courtroom?" "No, Your Honor," Simone replied. "We planned to bring you in quietly next week. But when you decided to abuse your position to publicly humiliate me, you accelerated our timeline." She kept her voice professional, giving him more dignity than he had given her. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As she recited his Miranda rights, the courtroom remained in shocked silence. Judge Harmon's face was a mask of disbelief as Simone secured the handcuffs around his wrists, not too tight, but secure. "You have the right to an attorney," she continued. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The judge who had presided over countless arraignments was now experiencing one himself. Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward with a court order. "We also have a warrant to search your chambers and home." 2 officers were already heading toward the judge's private chambers, where they would find even more evidence: bonophones, notes about cases, and a safe containing over $30,000 in cash. As they led Judge Harmon toward the door, he looked back at his bench, the symbol of authority he had misused for years. In just minutes, his career and reputation had crumbled around him. 3 months passed since that unforgettable day in Courtroom 7. The courthouse still buzzed with talk about how Judge Richard Harmon had been led away in handcuffs. The story had made national news, with headlines like, "Judge calls Detective Nobody, gets arrested minutes later," spreading across social media and news outlets. Detective Simone Washington sat in a different courtroom now, watching as Harmon was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his black robe. How small he looked without his elevated bench and air of authority. His hair had grown grayer in just a few months, and he kept his eyes down as he shuffled to his seat beside his attorney. The evidence against him had been overwhelming. The search of his chambers revealed a hidden safe containing $32,500 in cash. His home computer held spreadsheets tracking payments against case numbers. Most damning were the recorded conversations with defendants' family members, negotiating how much it would cost to make charges go away. In the gallery behind Simone sat Officer Trent, the courthouse security guard who had wished her luck that morning months ago. He leaned forward and whispered, "Never thought I'd see him on that side of the courtroom." Simone nodded silently. She didn't feel the satisfaction some might have expected. Instead, she felt a deep sadness for the justice system that had been corrupted, for the victims who had been denied justice, for the community's broken trust. Judge Lisa Powell entered the courtroom, a respected judge brought in from another county to ensure impartiality. The proceedings moved quickly. Harmon had agreed to a plea deal to avoid a public trial that would have exposed even more of his misconduct. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Powell instructed. Harmon stood shakily beside his attorney, looking much older than his 63 years. "Richard Harmon, this court has accepted your guilty plea to the charges of accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, and abuse of office. Before I pronounce sentence, do you have anything you wish to say?" Harmon cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I have served this community for nearly 20 years. I made mistakes, but—" "Mistakes?" Judge Powell interrupted. "Mr. Harmon, taking a bribe once might be called a mistake. Your actions show a pattern of corruption spanning years. You betrayed your oath, you betrayed this court, and you betrayed the public's trust." Harmon's shoulders slumped further. He said nothing more. Judge Powell continued, "I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Your law license will be revoked, and you will forfeit your pension and all assets gained through your criminal activity." The gavel came down with a decisive crack. As Harmon was led away, he glanced at Simone, their eyes meeting briefly. No words were exchanged, but his look held a mixture of shame and resignation. After the sentencing, Simone walked down the courthouse steps, where Police Chief Thomas waited beside a podium set up for a press conference. "Detective Washington," he said, extending his hand. "Ready to make the announcement?" She took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." Reporters gathered around as the chief stepped up to the microphone. "Today marks a significant step toward restoring integrity to our justice system. Former Judge Harmon's sentencing closes a dark chapter, but our work continues. That's why I'm pleased to announce the formation of our county's first permanent judicial integrity unit." He motioned for Simone to join him. "And I'm even more pleased to announce that Detective Simone Washington has been promoted to lieutenant and will head this new unit. Her exceptional work in uncovering judicial corruption makes her the perfect choice to lead this important effort." Cameras flashed as Simone stepped forward. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but she understood its importance now. "Thank you, Chief," she said into the microphone. "The Judicial Integrity Unit will work to ensure that what happened with Judge Harmon never happens again." A reporter called out, "Lieutenant Washington, how does it feel knowing that the judge who called you a nobody will now spend years in prison?" Simone paused, considering her words carefully. "This isn't about personal vindication. It's about upholding the oath we all took to serve and protect. Nobody is above the law, not even judges." Another reporter raised her hand. "What would you say to others who face discrimination or disrespect in their workplace?" "Document everything. Know your worth. Build allies. And remember that sometimes the person who underestimates you is giving you the greatest advantage." Simone smiled slightly. "If Judge Harmon hadn't been so focused on putting me in my place, he might have noticed I was building a case against him." As the press conference ended, Simone's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "So proud of you, Lieutenant. Your father is smiling down today." The courthouse stood tall behind her, its stone facade unchanged, but what happened inside forever transformed. The nobody that Judge Harmon had dismissed now wore a lieutenant's badge and led a unit created because of her work. Sometimes justice came in unexpected ways, but it always arrived eventually.